few more people in. I have just muted you all. Just bear with me a little while. I've sort of a few people in the waiting room, so that I'll let them in before I kick off. Just another one arriving.
$173 there.
Okay. Well, welcome everybody. Thank you so much for joining us this evening for our first talk of 2021. I'm really delighted we've got so many of you joining us this evening, and it's lovely that obviously there's a lot of you that have joined a lot of our talks, but I'm really pleased that there's so many new people to the Zoom talks and also new people to the Friends. So welcome to the talk. I'll just briefly go through the sort of format of this evening. Bear with me, the people who know the format. I'm just going to go through the running order, and I will then pass over to Bruce Parker, who will do some brief introductions about the speaker, and has got a couple of other things to say. Then we will pass over to Johanna to do her talk. The talk's probably going to last about 30 to 35 minutes. And then at the end, there'll be a chance to have to ask any questions. I know there's a lot of us on the Zoom call, but there's three ways to ask questions. You can either just unmute yourself and shout out, that's absolutely fine. Or you can send a question on the chat. Probably some of you know how to do that. Or you can also drop me an email during the talk. Also, if you think of any questions after the talk's finished, please email me tomorrow or in the coming days, and I can get those questions over to Johanna to answer. So that's the format. As you've probably seen in the email, we're really delighted that we've had such an overwhelming response to it. So we have upgraded our Zoom license. I don't think I could have ever believed it 10 months ago when we started that we'd have this number of people, but it does mean that we are able to have more than 100 people now. So that's great. I think that's all I've got to say. So I will pass over to Bruce for some introductions.
Hello, good evening everybody. Happy New Year to you all, and thank you very much indeed for joining us. It's amazing, biggest audience so far, as Lucy said, for a talk. Welcome to the new members. Really pleased to see you. Anybody overseas as well. I think I understand that Lorna Atwell is with us tonight. Special welcome to you, Lorna.
Thank you.
Hi. And I just thought, for those of you who don't know, it is our 90th anniversary this year of the Friends, and I did write to our patron, Her Majesty, just to sort of remind her, as it were, that it was our 90th, and give our good wishes for. I wrote in December for Christmas and the New Year, and I had this back. I just thought you'd like to just get a flavour of what she sent from Windsor Castle. Warm thanks to the Friends of Winchester Cathedral for the letter I sent. As your patron, I was pleased to learn of the success of the many virtual events which have been organised since the outbreak of the pandemic, and of the funding by members for installation in the cathedral to allow online video streaming of services. Your continued support and thoughtfulness in writing as you did are much appreciated. In return, I send my best wishes to you all for a most memorable year celebrating this notable anniversary in the history of the Friends of Winchester Cathedral. And it's signed Elizabeth R. So I thought I'd share that with you. I think it's really good that we've got her support, and quite a fillip to begin the year. So on to our talk, and it's Johanna Strong. I know Johanna quite well now, but only through Zooms after the services that we stream. She's a very loyal member of that, and always very interesting to hear from you, Johanna. Johanna is a second-year PhD student at Winchester University. She's got a particular interest in Mary, and judging by this title, Mary the First of England, how bloody was she? I think possibly she's suggesting that maybe we need to revise our thoughts on Mary. I don't know, but we shall find out. So without further ado, as they say, over to you, Johanna. Thank you.
Wonderful. Just get myself
unmute.
Okay. So before we get started,
Oh, well, don't worry.
to say a massive thank you to Lucy and the trustees for the invitation to speak to you today.
Yeah, well, I'm going to go on. I better go on the other one.
That Lucy puts into making sure we're all muted and unmuted.
I better go on my, well, I don't know.
I'm also really grateful to each and every one of you who has come to hear this talk. I never in a million years thought that so many of you would come and want to hear me talk. So I just want
right.
everyone can see and hear me okay? There's no panicking.
Yeah, we can.
Good sign. Okay. Perfect. So let's get started then. I've organized this talk into 3 different sections with a few themes which play an important part in my PhD. So the first section will be an introduction to Mary's life and reign. Given that Mary was on the throne for 5 years, that's way too much to include in one talk. So I'm only going to include the basic information that you'll need to understand the other sections. The second part will be focused on Winchester and Mary's relationship with the cathedral. As most of you will know, especially anyone who attended Dr. Ellie Whitaker's talk last autumn, Mary was married in Winchester Cathedral. So I'll be talking more about her marriage and how it was perceived at the time. Finally, I'll be addressing the main portion of the talk's title by looking at how quote unquote bloody Mary really is. There's a lot of perceptions about Mary that were created after her death, and so I'll cover those a little bit. I know there's going to be a lot of information and facts and analysis thrown at you during this talk, so I thought we could start with something a little more fun. Over Christmas, I bought myself a new tea towel, which sounds boring, I know, but I really love it. Normally, as you can imagine, I cringe immediately and my back straightens when I hear Mary referred to as Bloody Mary. But when I saw this tea towel sold as a Bloody Mary tea towel, I had to get it. Why, you might ask? Because I'm a sucker for puns. Some of you may have noticed that this famous portrait of Mary has a few additions, including vodka, Tabasco sauce, celery, and tomatoes. I couldn't not buy a tea towel where Mary was holding everything she needed to make a Bloody Mary cocktail. I just had to. But now for some more serious stuff. Let's talk about some important facts about Mary's life, some of which I'll cover and some of which will simply appear on the screen to give you a sense of the timing of Mary's reign. Mary was born on February 18th, 1516, to Catherine of Aragon and Henry VIII. She was the only one of Catherine of Aragon's children to live past childhood, and as a result of the breakdown of her parents' marriage, she suffered greatly watching her mother exiled from court and left to die alone at Kimbleton in 1536. Just under 20 years later, though, Mary's situation changed drastically when she was proclaimed queen in July 1553 after Lady Jane Grey's brief tenure on the throne. Most of the time when heirs to the throne become king or queen, their suffering and unhappiness ends. Unfortunately for Mary, this simply wasn't the case. She's been overlooked, forgotten, or worse, vilified since her death on November 17, 1558, particularly since she set the precedent for all future crowned queen regnants because of the religious policies she undertook and because of her marriage to Philip II of Spain. As historian Anna Whitelock has said, the way that Mary ruled can be seen to define how female monarchy would function in England. But it's also important to recognize that women aren't unique in this leadership role. Instead, in the words of Sharon Jansen, quote, occupy a place in and perpetuate a continuing, though largely unrecognized, tradition of political rule, end quote. For anyone studying monarchy, and especially queenship, there's one theory you need to know if you want to understand how monarchy was and is sometimes still perceived. That's Ernst Kantorowicz' theory on the monarch's two bodies. Don't worry, there is not a quiz. You do not have to remember this name. It's the idea that every monarch has two bodies. One is their personal body, the one that needs to eat and sleep, and the other is the body politic, the one that governs and rules and is passed from one monarch to their successor at death. This theory, as Marian revisionist historian Sarah Duncan has found in her research, grew during Mary's reign, particularly since the early modern world saw women's bodies as weak, so there needed to be a way to make female monarchies seem stronger and more stable. Despite this, many exiled reformers who had left England when the Catholic Mary came to the throne still feared female rule, particularly Catholic female rule. Mary's reign cannot really be described as a failure, though, despite how it's portrayed in the traditional English historical narrative. Mary's reign was stable, even when there was famine, and a flu which may have killed up to 6% of the English population at the time. I think after the year that was 2020, we can appreciate how great that achievement was. Mary also reformed the coinage, and however you see this, reintroduced Catholicism as England's official religion. There's also been a recent major focus on Mary as a precedent for Elizabeth I. Before Elizabeth claimed that she was married to the realm, Mary presented her coronation ring as her wedding band to her realm. And before Elizabeth claimed that she was her people's mother, Mary assured her subjects that though she had never had a child, she imagined that a mother's love was the same as that which she held for her subjects. Even Elizabeth's marriage negotiations were based on Mary and Philip's negotiations and marriage treaty. The elephant in the room that we haven't yet addressed are Mary's religious policies. Over the course of her reign, around 280 people were executed for heresy, which broadly means that they failed to practice Christianity according to the Catholic rite. At the same time that Mary's regime welcomed Catholicism back into England, it continued to partially reject papal authority, thus creating, in Alexander Sampson's words, quote, an indigenous, innovative Catholicism that influenced theological debates at Trent and beyond, end quote. One Elizabethan source recalls that in Mary's time, quote, then was there burning and hanging at home, end quote. The longer Mary's reign went on, the number of burnings, the punishment for heresy, decreased, meaning that fewer people were being found guilty of heresy, and so fewer people were being sentenced to die. But that isn't how history remembers it, as we can see from the 1776 publication. I know many of you are probably thinking that burning as a punishment for heresy is a tad extreme, but that was the accepted method of punishment for heresy in the early modern European world. Mary and her regime certainly weren't unusual in its introduction. Before he died, Mary's predecessor and brother Edward VI was on the verge of introducing burning as punishment, though of course the heresy that he would punish would be not following the Reformed faith. Interestingly, Mary is portrayed in a much more positive way in Spain, where she is recognized and praised for her piety. Now that we've gone over the basic biographical details of Mary's reign and have talked a bit about how gender and religion have affected our memory of her reign, let's turn to her marriage. Mary and Philip married, as you might recognize, in Winchester Cathedral, partly out of fear of the London crowds and London disease. It was, after all, the middle of the summer, which was the high season for plague and other contagious diseases. They also married there partly because at Winchester, the wedding could be performed by Bishop Gardiner. Gardiner was the Bishop of Winchester, as well as the Chancellor of England. So if he performed the wedding, then it would hold secular and spiritual authority. One thing that is rarely said about Mary and Philip's wedding is that during the marriage negotiations, Philip signed an ad cautelum, which literally translates from Latin to with caution. This ad cautelum declared that Philip had signed the marriage treaty under duress, meaning that he wouldn't have to follow its tenets if he decided it was unsuitable later on in their marriage. A contemporary Spanish source notes that Philip, quote, protested against the articles and everything contained therein, desiring that it should forever be recorded as a plain, clear, and certain fact that he was marrying Mary not of his own free will, end quote. If there was any doubt that Philip was serious, he swore on Christ, the Virgin Mary, the sign of the cross, and the gospel itself. So we can see that as a practicing Catholic, he was pretty serious about that. There are quite a few reasons why Philip may have done this. Maybe he thought that the marriage treaty was more favorable to England than it was to Spain, so wanted to find a way to back out of the marriage if it proved too unpopular with his Spanish subjects. More likely, though, was that he realized Mary was unlikely to give him an heir. If we take a step back, Mary was 37 at this point, and Philip was in his mid-20s. Mary was approaching menopause, and so the odds of her conceiving were admittedly slim. This put Philip in an awkward spot, because one of the main reasons for a king marrying was to secure a dynastic alliance and to produce heirs. If Mary couldn't do this for him, it was unlikely to be seen as a successful marriage. Or rather, what I should say is that the conception of heirs was the traditional role of a queen consort. If we remember, though, Mary was a queen regnant, a queen in her own right. The tension between Mary's monarchical authority as a queen regnant and her childbearing role typical of a queen consort came to the fore when her marriage to Philip was announced. Early modern women were expected to listen to their husband, so Mary's gender was a massive concern for her subjects. There were great concerns that Mary would become the traditional wife when she married Philip. Would all her patronage pass to him as the husband? Would her political and property rights also go to him? These concerns remained, even though the marriage treaty was quite clear that Mary would retain all the power and authority she had held before she married. One of my favorite facts about Mary and Philip's wedding is that Philip actually took the traditionally female vows. In their proxy wedding, done before Philip arrived in England, likely as an effort to make sure that Philip wouldn't be abandoned by Mary if a better groom came along for her, Philip's vows were, quote, per verba de praesenti, which means literally by words of the present. So this made the marriage valid and legal from that moment. On the other hand, Mary took the traditionally male vows of per verba de futuro, literally by words in the future, which made their marriage valid and legal from a specified future moment. Once again, Mary took the dominant role in their partnership. Mary and Philip's statuses were also made very clear in their physical positioning during the wedding ceremony and the ensuing banquet. Mary was always on the right-hand side during the ceremony, the more prestigious position. Spanish subjects were also particularly conscious that during the wedding banquet, Mary was served on gold plate, while Philip was only served on silver. And you can see here on the left of your screen the chair that Winchester Cathedral has, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, that Mary reportedly used during her wedding. Philip wore white cloth of gold to the wedding ceremony, which is essentially a white piece of fabric that has beaten thread of gold sewn into it. So it's very expensive and it's very much a status symbol. Traditionally, though, a queen consort wore white cloth of gold to her coronation. So Philip's wedding outfit indicated to Mary's subjects that he was firmly England's king consort to Mary's queen regnant. Mary was by far being presented as the higher status member of the couple, but many of her subjects failed to notice or chose not to. Later, when Mary and Philip entered London for the first time as a couple, Mary was again on the right-hand side. Those who had come from Spain with Philip were deeply upset that Philip was seemingly still coming second to Mary, even after he had been proclaimed King of Naples, a nice wedding present from his father. There were some concessions and changes the longer they were married. Originally, Mary was on the right side of the coin face, with Philip on the left. But as she pushed for Philip's coronation as king consort, Philip appeared on the right-hand side for the first time. While I find this all really interesting and very thought-provoking, what I'm really fascinated by is how Mary and Philip's marriage has been understood after the fact, and how this posthumous interpretation differs from contemporary perceptions of Mary's life and reign. So it's those contemporary Marian perceptions that we've seen so far. At the time, some opposition to the marriage was based on religious antipathy to Catholicism, but mostly, quote, the fear of a Spanish servitude, end quote. As soon as Mary died and Elizabeth came to the throne, however, the continuing of Catholicism in England was rather tenuous. The longer Elizabeth was on the throne, the greater the threat became, which was posed by Catholic European powers, meaning that in the Elizabethan imagination, Mary's marriage became a moment of Catholic tyranny over England. During Mary's lifetime, though, as one historian has put it, quote, everything still seemed to be possible, end quote. In Mary's reign, Catholicism could still triumph in England, and it wasn't a given that Mary would be seen as an aberration of English history. Many have also criticized Mary for marrying a foreigner. The issue with that criticism is that Mary really had no other choice. She couldn't marry one of her subjects. How would that look if a husband was the head of the family and so was superior to his wife, the queen? In addition, Philip was the most eligible bachelor in Europe at this point. Why would Mary marry a subject when she could have the best possible marriage there was? It was only once England became consistently Protestant during Elizabeth's reign and since, and they've become consistently wary of foreigners, that Mary's marriage to Philip II became seen as a moment where the monarch, in a sense, sacrificed England to its enemies. And surely the marriage treaty between Mary and Philip wasn't so awful if Elizabeth I used it as a precedent for her own marriage negotiations in the 1560s. Up to now, we've looked a bit at Mary's life, and we've looked at how her wedding and marriage were understood during Mary and a little bit into Elizabeth's lifetimes. You're probably wondering, though, where the title of this talk comes into play. Well, we're to that point now. My doctoral research focuses on why Mary has been remembered the way that she has in the traditional English and later British historical narrative. So now we'll be looking at why Mary's marriage is remembered as such a dark spot in English history, when it wasn't really seen that way during Mary's lifetime. Marian expert Alexander Sampson's most recent work argues that, quote, the image of an emotionally hysterical queen beset by tragedy exculpates the Tudor monarch in order to reassign agency and blame to Catholics and foreigners, end quote. Mary's reign has become, quote unquote, deeply intertwined with the Reformation and the British Empire. So she's caught up in two of the most important aspects of the English and British national identity and history. English and British patriotism is deeply tied to anti-Catholicism and anti-papalism, which means that it's unfortunately inherently anti-Spanish and anti-Marian. Further, the early modern English Empire defined itself in opposition to the Spanish Empire. So the Black Legend, which vilified Philip II, and by extension Mary, was kept alive beyond its historical relevancy. Interestingly, the anti-Marian sentiment that is evident in the traditional English and British historical narrative was first encouraged by Protestant exiles and really wasn't a defining feature of Mary's reign until after her death. John Foxe, author of Acts and Monuments, or more commonly known as the Book of Martyrs, a copy of which can be found in the Morley Library at Winchester Cathedral, was instrumental in creating Mary into a bloody figure of history, portraying in intense detail as he did the religious persecution undertaken during Mary's reign. Foxe's work, however, cannot in any stretch of the imagination be termed unbiased. He was of a reforming mindset and encouraged the return of England to Protestantism under Elizabeth I. So it's understandable that his work would portray a Catholic queen in such a negative light. Not that it condones Mary's behavior, but burning as a punishment for heresy, as I've said before, was an accepted practice in the early modern European world. Further, the fear of foreign rule, which many Elizabethans perceived to have been narrowly avoided during Mary's reign, reemerged when Elizabeth I entered marriage negotiations with foreigners. Susan Doran, a leading Elizabethan historian, argues that the English people were so worried about one of Elizabeth's proposed marriages with France because the prospective husband was Catholic, and so there was seen to be a potential, quote, dreaded return to popery, end quote, a reminder, quote, of the experience of burnings and exiles during Mary's reign, end quote. These fears emerged too at the same time that recusancy in England was growing, and so the threat of inconspicuous English Catholicism was seen to be even greater. For those who are unfamiliar with the term, a recusant is anyone who practices, in this case Catholicism, secretly and against the official laws of the country. One contemporary Elizabethan source even goes so far as to say that an Elizabethan marriage to France could be worse than the Marian marriage to Spain, because at least in Mary's reign, the Catholic Holy League hadn't yet been in existence. If Elizabeth married a French noble, then she was marrying an entire alliance of Catholic forces, something which was incomprehensible to many of Elizabeth's Protestant subjects. Even more significantly, an Elizabethan fear was that Elizabeth would be drawn into foreign wars, quote, as Queen Mary was with King Philip against France, whereby Calais was lost, end quote. Finally, and to bring us back to Mary and Philip's marriage more specifically, quote, the problem with Mary is in many ways a problem with Philip, end quote. Philip represented much of what Elizabethan English people were afraid of: foreigners and Catholics. These fears reemerged, as Marian scholar Sarah Duncan puts it, quote, in the reign of Elizabeth I, each time she contemplated marrying a foreigner, suggesting that the particular nationality of Mary's spouse held no real significance, and that the English would have objected to a foreign king consort, whatever his country of origin, end quote. Naturally, Mary became the scapegoat for the introduction of these two elements into Elizabethan society, and so she was vilified as being an un-English monarch. Alexander Sampson's strongest statement in his work, and what I think really encapsulates why Mary is remembered the way that she is, relates to how modern British people see Mary and their own history. He says that, quote, the acceptability of Mary's foreign marriage will no doubt continue to inflect the evolving relationship between Britain and Europe and its cultural politics, end quote. As Britain's relationship and connection to the rest of Europe becomes more strained at an administrative and governmental level, there really is no other option than to continue the traditional anti-Catholic and anti-foreigner historical narrative, and vice versa. Karina Streckfuss provides perhaps the best summary of this complex narrative. Quote, that Mary and Philip's marriage lost its attraction with time cannot be blamed on unsuccessful propaganda, but on the course of history, end quote. So hopefully that is giving you a nice little brief overview and a short analysis of why we think that Mary is bloody and why I don't think that's how she should be remembered. If you have more questions, I'm obviously happy to answer them now, but if you think of them later, feel free to drop me or Lucy an email. I am happy to take any and all questions.
Before we go on to questions, I'm just going to hand over to Tom Watson, one of our trustees.
All right. I hope you can all hear me. We had a few rumbles as we were going through. Thanks, Johanna, about Mary. How bloody was she? I mean, I keep thinking that, you know, was it 280 people are executed for heresy during her reign? Could I feed in a question before everyone else, which is, how close was Mary to the decision-making over the prosecution and execution of heretics? I mean, is part of the argument that this is what happened, and as queen, it happened beneath her, or did she have an active policy of her government, of which she was the queen regnant, in which she fully supported it?
So that's a bit of a tricky question. So there are a lot of layers in answering that. The biggest one is that Mary, during her reign, definitively tried to keep it that she was the one making decisions. She was obviously being advised by her counselors, and she was being advised by, you know, friends, family, anyone she was in close contact with, but that the ultimate decision lay with her and with Parliament. She was always very careful that anything that she wanted to put into practice, that it went through all of the proper channels and that it went through Parliament, so that at the end of the day, if it came back, it wasn't on her alone. So she couldn't be called, you know, a tyrant or a dictator because Parliament had also made the decision. But the issue then that we get with this punishment for heresy is that she begins to punish heretics almost at the same time that Philip comes to England. And so for a long time, it's been seen that Philip was the one who was encouraging her and advising her that this is how you should do it. And so we get, after Mary's death, we see that similarity emerge between what England has done with its punishment for heresy and what the Spanish Inquisition has done in Spain. And so we get that comparison between England and Spain in a rather unfair way, I think. And so there's that confusion that at one point, you know, Mary is the queen and she's the one with Parliament making decisions. But at the same time, this policy begins as Philip comes to England. And so a lot of regular people who are witnessing this, but also historians, have tried to pull apart how much of this is Philip's influence and how much of this is just he happens to be coming to England as Mary is starting to sink her teeth into policy. So that's, I guess, a really roundabout way of we don't know, but I would venture to say that it's Mary who is making decisions, taking into account the advice from those around her and those whom she trusts.
And just sort of a final sort of question, and following on from your discussion about the marriage, was it because Mary's mother, you know, was Catherine of Aragon, was there a line of relationship or political relationship between the Aragonese and Philip's father, or the ruling House of Spain. Was that Castile? I'm not very hot on Spain at that time, but put it this way: was there a rather than having just the most eligible bachelor in Europe, was there a political connection?
Oh yes, of course there was.
Absolutely. And again, I will say this is not unusual for the day and age, but you might get looked at weird if you do this today. Philip's father, Charles V, was the cousin of Catherine of Aragon. So Philip, Catherine of Aragon was Charles V's aunt, sorry. And so Mary and Philip are kind of weirdly closely related, but not first cousins. And so there is that sense of a connection that he is family. And when Catherine of Aragon had been exiled from court and was being kept basically under house arrest without any of her friends or her ladies, Mary was supported by Spain. And at one point, there's a rumor that the Spanish ambassadors have a boat that's in the channel and they're just waiting to get Mary on the boat to bring her back to Spain. And so there's this kind of idea in Mary's childhood and teen years that she got from Spain that support and encouragement and love that she couldn't get from her own mother because they were separated and then Catherine of Aragon had died, and that she didn't always get from her father and her siblings. And so there's that personal connection, and then there's also that familial connection, and then of course that political connection that Spain has at this point, one of the largest empires. You know, why would you not marry into that and be given the safety, security, and wealth that comes with that?
Okay, well, thanks, Johanna. And just to say, I counted up 187 people watching, well, 187 accounts linked in. So well done. You've scored the top numbers so far this year. So I'm going to pass you back to Lucy and on to questions from chat. But thanks so much for a really interesting presentation.
Thank you.
Now we've got a few questions in the chat, and I think we will go through them all because we have got a little bit of time left. So in no particular order, as a question about contemporary European models. Yeah, were there any contemporary European models of successful Queen's regent that Mary could draw on from Europe? So that's the first question.
Yeah, so there are actually quite a few. And of course, because I'm on the spot, all of the names are escaping me except for one. But Mary's own mother was actually Mary's grandmother is actually a really good example. Sorry, I was so stuck on Catherine of Aragon for a second. Mary's grandmother on her mother's side is a really good example of that. So we have Isabella of Castile, and she is a queen regnant in her own right. And so she's the Queen of Castile and marries Ferdinand of Aragon, and so they unite Spain. But when Isabella dies, the thrones become disconnected again. And so we see that Isabella really held the throne of Castile in her own right and didn't give that to her husband. And so we see in Isabella a woman who rallied her troops. We see a queen who was defending her country against invasion as they saw it. She was deeply involved in the religious policies. And so I think Mary would have, maybe not consciously, but would have looked to her as an example. Because at this point, the medieval world had seen, maybe not in England, they hadn't seen queen regnants, but they had seen very, very strong regents. So women who were either married to the king, and when he was off at war or on crusades, she was effectively the ruling power in England. Or we have it when sons inherit the throne when their father dies, but they're too young to rule. The mother is often put in place as a regent to make decisions for him until he's old enough to make his own. And so England has a really strong history of female rule, even before the first official crowned queen regnant. And so I think in Mary's world, it wasn't unusual to see women in power. It just hadn't been something official that had happened yet in England.
Thank you for that. There's a question from Andrew Thompson. He's saying that you discussed Foxe briefly and you gave the impression that it was a largely an exercise in propaganda. Do you dispute the numbers of those who were burned or the pain they suffered? And how does her record of executions compare to Henry VIII or Elizabeth I?
So I think the first part of that is really important, I guess, to clarify and to say, for the record, on the record, I think the pain that was inflicted by the religious policies certainly is not something I would wish on anyone. As much as I say that's how it was done in the day, it still is not a painless or how we would see today a merciful punishment. So it by no means, in saying that Mary shouldn't be called Bloody Mary, am I saying that there's a loss of life that is justifiable or okay, or something to be condoned. And so there's that tension reading Foxe that, yes, he is giving a report of people who have been, from his perspective, unjustly executed for their religious beliefs. And where the kind of propaganda comes into it is that he very much is creating a narrative that is there to make a point. So we have many editions of Foxe's Acts and Monuments. And as the first one is published, people start writing into Foxe or say like, hey, can you tell him that? And so he collects all of these new stories of what he terms the martyrs. And so when he writes the next edition, he puts all of these together and creates an even bigger story. And then when he realizes, oh, there are some inconsistencies, like some of this just isn't gonna fly, he takes out parts that don't make sense. And he takes out parts that don't, that could be seen as, oh, like there's a contradictory statement. And so he really edits his narrative to make sure that it portrays Mary as this horrifically tyrannical monarch. And so at the same time that this would be hugely traumatic for people who were put on trial, people who were convicted of heresy, it's also been put down in history and it's grown into this story that Mary, sat back and in the modern day would be eating popcorn watching this happen. And I don't think that's a very fair representation of her, if that answers the question, hopefully. It's a really tricky one and a really complex one, and one that you could probably do an entire thesis on.
Do you mind if I make a comment there?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
If I can be heard.
You can, Andrew, we can hear you, yes.
Right. There was another part to my question. That was this comparison with Henry VIII
yes.
and Elizabeth I. And if I may just add to that, I think I heard, well, I know it's 282 martyrs in Foxe's book. I mean, that's over 5 years. Now, was there anything like that under Henry VIII or Elizabeth I? 5 years, 280 odd executions.
So part of the problem there is that Mary does it in 5 years. She goes in, guns blazing, ready to take out heresy as she sees it. And so by the end of her reign, it's really significant that the number of people who are being convicted of heresy drops drastically and very suddenly. And so we see that people either are coming to terms with, let's just go to mass, nobody has to get hurt, or people are coming around to the fact that, well, we're Catholic now, let's just embrace that. And so we see that there is, I don't want to term it success because that makes it seem very uncaring, but we do see that there is this, it's such an effective, if you want to say that, policy, that it is, for Mary's intents and purposes, it is working. But what we see under Henry VIII and Elizabeth is arguably equal or worse. It just happens that they're on the throne for longer, so they stretch this out a little bit more. And Elizabeth starts off on a very patient and calm note because she inherits from Mary essentially a divided realm. Some are Protestant, some are Catholic. Nobody is really sure how that's going to turn out. And so she kind of makes a very fine line between the two so that there's a certain sense of compromise. And it's not until Elizabeth is excommunicated in the 1570s, and it's not until really the Spanish Armada, where Catholicism is seen as this massive threat, and where Elizabeth really clamps down on what she terms as treason. And that's the big sticking point here for Elizabeth's reign, is that Mary executes people for heresy. And so that's seen as outlandish, and how could she? And that's just a, senseless death. But Elizabeth flips it and makes being a Catholic treason. So Elizabeth is executing traitors, which we all go, oh, well, yeah, if they're against the state, that's fine. And so Elizabeth flips that, is we can't do a perfect comparison because Elizabeth has termed them traitors. So the number of heretics who are executed under Elizabeth is far fewer, but only because Elizabeth has, in a sense, moved that goalpost and has created a new definition of a heretic and a traitor.
Thank you. Now, a couple more questions. First one from Andrew White, saying really interesting talk. So you gave a lot of information about how her marriage was seen in England, but how was it seen in Spain? I don't know if you could give us a little bit of information about that.
Yeah, so I think she's by far better remembered in Spain than she is here. In marrying Philip, obviously he becomes king consort of England, but she also becomes queen consort of everywhere that he is king. And so their official title when they get married is Philip and Mary, dukes of Sicily and archdukes of other places and Brabant and part of, his European empire. At one point, she's queen of Jerusalem. So she inherits all of his titles. And so in Spain, she's held up as, the queen of the king, and they love the king. And as her reign progresses and they see that she is such a dedicated Catholic, she's remembered in a better light because she fits what the quote unquote perfect Catholic queen should is. She's leading her people, she's supporting her husband, and she's making sure that Catholicism remains an important facet of public life. And so, whereas in England, she's Bloody Mary and gets, a London dungeon exhibition with ads that are so awful that they get banned. In Spain, she has a tube station named after her, and she has a road named after her. So she's remembered a lot more nicely in Spain, where there isn't that sense of anti-Catholicism and where there isn't that fear of, a foreigner coming in and trying to take over power.
Thank you very much. Now, we're just going to take one question from Bruce, I think.
Yeah, hi, Johanna. It's just more an observation than a question. If Philip and Mary, if that hadn't been a phantom pregnancy, but she'd had a child, then we of course wouldn't have had Elizabeth or any of the other subsequent monarchs, but we would also probably now be Roman Catholic and speaking Spanish, wouldn't we?
Yeah, so it's really interesting. If I thought ahead more, I would have pulled it up. But there's a really interesting document that's part of the marriage treaty that lays out what would happen if Mary becomes pregnant and what would happen if it's a girl and if it's a boy. And so there are two different, but essentially saying almost the same thing, that any child that Mary has will be the monarch in England. Spain does not get any part of England once Mary is dead. Philip gets no right to the throne. Philip doesn't, like, he has to go back to Spain or wherever else he wants to live, but he can't be in England. And so what's interesting is that they decide if Mary becomes pregnant, then if it's a girl, she'll be Queen of England. And she still has to get her brother's, her half-brother, Philip's son from another marriage. She has to get his permission to marry, but she's still queen in England. And she would also get, I believe, part of the Spanish Netherlands at that point. So there's a very clear line in the marriage treaty that, you know, England won't be subsumed into Spain, but we can assume that given that any daughter of Mary would have to essentially check with her brother if it was okay to get married to someone, there still would be a sense of Spanish influence. And the biggest fear was that if Mary died and had a child and the child was very young, then the natural person to act on behalf of this child would be Philip. And so then essentially Philip becomes the reigning monarch of England. And so that was the biggest fear. But as you say, Mary had one, potentially two phantom pregnancies. So she believes that she's pregnant, but it turns out she isn't. And that changes a lot of the course of history for a lot of things. But it is interesting to see that that was a major part of them negotiating power before they got married, is just how much power would Philip have over any potential children, and how much power would he have once Mary died, whether Mary had kids or didn't.
Okay, thanks very much.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Thank you so much. Now, there's a few more questions, but what I'll probably do is we'll take those down from the chat and we'll get back. Well, when I send out an email tomorrow, we'll send some answers for some of those. So I just wanted to say thank you very much again to Johanna for the fantastic talk. I hope you've all enjoyed it. Just a few kind of notices. As some of you have already signed up, we have got another event next week. We've got our virtual tour of Westminster with Steve Brine. Now, the limit for that was 100, but we've managed to persuade Steve's office to upgrade their Zoom account as well, because we were oversubscribed for that. So if you haven't signed up for it and you do want to come, what will happen on Tuesday, and she's a 7:30 start rather than the usual 7 o'clock, is Steve will take us round Westminster after hours and do a kind of tour so we can see around the different parts of Westminster. And then he will sit back down and do a kind of general Q&A session. I think it's going to be a little bit like when we did the Friends trip 2 years ago. We met him on the terrace. We had some lively chat, but not too political. So it's just interesting to hear his views on the things he's experienced about. And So let me know if you want to come on Tuesday. Our next talk like this, we're very pleased to have Canon Jane Hands and Dr. Tim Hands talking together about the link between the cathedral and the college. So fantastic to have a Canon and the headmaster of Winchester College, and the title of their talk is Cathedral and College, Breaching the Wall from Wickham to Wesley and Beyond. So let me know if you'd like to attend that. Also, if you do have any friends who you think might be interested in listening to these talks, please let me know and we can forward them a recording. Maybe friends who might be interested in becoming friends so they can join in this series of lectures from now to May. I know that many of you said you have donated. Obviously, it's not compulsory, but if you do want to donate, we're very grateful for donations. So thank you for that. And I think that's it for this evening. So thank you very much for joining us, and see you again soon.
Thanks very much, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. Excellent.
Thank you.
Really lovely. Thank you very much. Yes. Wonderful.
Thank you.
Really interesting.
Excellent.
Very interesting. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Oh yes, interesting. Why was Philip so concerned about no? Why didn't my thing ever go through? Doesn't matter because the question was asked anyway. But yes. Well, yeah, I think so.
Hello, how are you? How are you in Ashurst?
That's good, Lucy, wasn't it?
Yeah, very interesting.
Very, yes.
Now, I tried to send you a question about Mary's phantom pregnancies, but I can't get it to send. I typed them out, but it just sits there, and obviously it's not joining the other ones. And anyway, Bruce asked the question anyway, so it didn't matter. But
that's very strange, actually.
because I don't have a send notice
No,
or
it happened
anything.
last time too, didn't it?
I think you should, well, type me another one and see if it works. I think you should type, and if you type and press return, it should work.
Where's chat?
Well, I mean, I'm sorry I didn't get around to your question. I was, there were quite a few, so we'll get that one answered.
I will happily answer any and every.
Yeah. Before we go, let's make a note of them. They're up on the chat. One of us can.
And you'll send us the answers, will you, Lucy, too?
Well, not me. I won't write the
I'll
answers.
have to have another session otherwise.
My chat isn't working at all now.
Is it not?
No.
What happens if I send you a message? Funny, isn't it?
You have to put his hand up like in school.
I just sent my chat to Lucy and not to everyone. Does that make it go adrift?
Oh, maybe that's better. Yes, you always send it to everyone, don't you?
Well, I do, but so do
Is it?
others.
Is that better? I've never managed. I'm not sure whether it worked or not. But is it better to send it to everyone or to send it to the chat?
I don't think it matters. It's quite nice when you're on it to see everyone's questions coming up. So I think it works. It works either way.
It's okay to do that. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. It was a great talk, though. Thank you very much.
Yeah, it was.
Anyway, we'll go now. Bye, everyone.
Right, just get
Of course, the Spanish. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you, Johanna. Yeah. This is Alistair is my father-in-law.
I wonder. I saw the last names and I thought there's got to be a connection.
So they're loyal followers of these talks, and it's Yeah, because of a genuine interest, not just because it's
Yes, actually, it was a lovely talk.
Yeah.
And you can answer in the future, because the Spanish had a bit of a record of burning everyone. They'd burnt 35,000 Dutch people, didn't they, or in the Netherlands. So we shouldn't be surprised, and perhaps we were lucky only to lose 280.
Yeah.
Although, of course, you know, if you're burning heretics, you've got that act of purification, you know, purifying with fire as well. But the Parliament thing was interesting, though. Of course, one needs to remember actually how the Parliament was very different to what it is today, not democratic, mainly nominated by the monarch. Privy Council sat there and everything. And so actually, to what extent are they a rubber stamp for what the monarch wants to do, but just gives an air of greater authority to something that they could have just done on their own. I don't know. But no, it was fascinating talk. I pop a question on email to you. I teach Tudor history myself, so a little bit.
Yeah.
So
only at A level, but
whereabouts do you teach now?
I'm teaching at Coleg Sir at the moment,
Right.
in Llethley.
Oh, interesting.
So yeah, greetings from Wales. And
I was going to say,
William
it's got to be Wales.
and